They say that in the deep winter of the forgotten year, 1709, the rain that fell upon the isolated city of Oakhaven did not taste of water but of iron and ash, a bitter omen that the heavens themselves were weeping for a tragedy that had not yet occurred but was already written in the stars. Welcome back, seekers of the hidden truth, to the Unveiled Scroll, where we peel back the layers of time to reveal the stories that history tried to bury in the dark. So if you are ready to walk through the shadows with us, please strike that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this chronicle with fellow travelers of the abyss. For today we delve into the haunting tale of the Silent Treaty. Our story takes us to the sovereign duchy of Oakhaven, a realm once renowned for its white marble walls that glowed like bone under the moonlight, and for a lineage of rulers who claimed their blood was blessed by the angels themselves. Yet it was this very pride that would cultivate the soil for their absolute ruin. At the helm of this glittering yet fragile empire stood Duke Valerius, a man of refined tastes and melancholic temperament, whose heart was not filled with the lust for conquest, but with a crippling fear of the inevitable decay that claims all mortal things. For Valerius loved his wife, the Duchess Alara, with a devotion that bordered on madness, seeing in her pale skin and raven hair not she as a woman, but the living embodiment of art itself, a masterpiece he wished to preserve against the cruel ravages of time. The court of Oakhaven was a spectacle of Baroque grandeur, where courtiers in velvet robes, the color of dried blood, whispered behind fans made of peacock feathers, and the air was perpetually thick with the scent of burning beeswax and decaying lilies, creating an atmosphere that was at once intoxicating and suffocating. It was in the autumn of that year that the Duchess Alara fell into a strange and sudden languor, a wasting sickness that baffled the most learned physicians of the continent, who came with their leeches and their charts of the humors only to shake their heads and retreat, leaving the Duke to pace the marble corridors of his palace like a caged tiger, his eyes hollow with the dawning realization that his beloved masterpiece was fading before his very eyes. As the weeks turned to months, the vibrancy of the duchy began to mirror the health of its mistress, with the once bustling markets growing quiet and the white marble walls appearing to gray as if the stone itself was sympathetic to the sorrow of its lord. Desperation is a dangerous key, for it unlocks doors that are meant to remain shut, and in his agony, Duke Valerius turned away from the church and the scholars and began to listen to the whispers of the old wives and the forbidden texts that spoke of bargaining with forces that dwell in the spaces between breaths. It was on a night when the moon was hidden behind a thick shroud of storm clouds that a stranger arrived at the iron gates of the palace, a figure cloaked in grey wool who carried no weapon or satchel but walked with the silent confidence of a man who knows he is expected. He introduced himself simply as Moraz the architect, and he promised the Duke not a cure, which is a fleeting thing of the flesh, but a preservation, a way to ensure that the beauty of the Duchess and the glory of Oakhaven would remain untouched by the rot of centuries provided. The Duke was willing to sign a treaty not with ink but with something far more precious. Valerius, blinded by his grief and seduced by the stranger's hypnotic voice, which sounded like the grinding of stones deep underground, invited Moraz into his private study, a room filled with ticking clocks that seemed to slow down as the stranger entered. The proposal was elegant in its horror, for Moraz claimed he could construct a mechanism, a great engine of stasis beneath the city that would freeze the essence of the duchy in a perfect eternal moment, halting death and decay. But the price for this miracle was silence, absolute and unbroken, for the machinery of eternity, he claimed, could not function amidst the chaotic noise of mortal life. The Duke looked at the portrait of his dying wife, her eyes capturing a sadness that pierced his soul, and then he looked at the parchment. The stranger laid before him a document that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. With a trembling hand, Valerius signed the silent treaty, unaware that he was not merely saving a life but condemning a civilization to a fate far worse than death. For the silence Moraz demanded was not merely the absence of sound, but the erasure of the human spirit's capacity to cry out against the dark. As the ink dried, the clocks in the room stopped one by one, and a heavy, unnatural stillness descended upon the palace, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums, a prelude to the symphony of quiet horror that was about to engulf the marble kingdom. The change began not with a roar, but with a creeping numbness that spread from the palace outwards like frost across a window pane for the morning. After the treaty was signed, the citizens of Oakhaven awoke to find that their voices had been stolen during the night, leaving them to mouth silent screams at the rising sun. The Duke rushed to Alara's chamber, finding her standing by the window, her skin glowing with an ethereal luminescence that was more mineral than flesh, and though the flush of health had returned to her cheeks, it was the painted flush of a porcelain doll rather than the warmth of blood. He called her name with tears of relief streaming down his face, yet she turned to him with a movement so smooth and mechanical it sent a shiver of primal dread down his spine, and she offered him no words. Only a vacant smile that did not reach her eyes, which were now as still and reflective as polished obsidian. Down in the belly of the city, the stranger Maras was nowhere to be seen but the ground beneath the cobblestones, hummed with a low rhythmic vibration, a heartbeat of iron and steam that resonated in the bones of every man, woman, and child, ensuring that the stasis remained unbroken. As days turned into weeks, the true nature of the architect's preservation revealed itself in horrifying detail, for the people of Oakhaven did not merely lose their voices. They began to lose their will to act their desires, fading into a collective apathy where the only imperative was to exist in perfect, unblemished stillness. The artisans in the workshops stopped creating new works content to polish the same silver chalice for eternity, and the bakers ceased to knead dough for. They no longer felt the pangs of hunger, only a dull, hollow sustainability that required neither food nor sleep. The city became a tableau vivant, a museum of the living where figures stood frozen in the streets for hours at a time, mimicking the statues that adorned their plazas, and the silence was so absolute that the falling of a leaf sounded like a thunderclap. Valerius wandered his perfect silent kingdom, a sovereign of ghosts, realizing too late that by halting the decay he had also halted life itself, for without the chaotic friction of change there is no joy, no sorrow, and no love, only the endless, terrifying continuity of the present moment. He tried to break the treaty to find Moros and demand a reversal, but the doors to the underground chambers were sealed, shut fused with the stone of the foundation, and the whispers of the stranger echoed in his mind, reminding him that perfection requires sacrifice, and that a masterpiece must never be altered. The horror was not in the violence, but in the tranquility, for Oakhaven had become a paradise of the damned, where no one suffered because no one felt anything at all, and the Duke was the only soul left with the capacity to weep, yet his tears fell silently onto the marble floor, leaving no stain. It was during the Festival of the Moon, a celebration that once rang with laughter and music, that the full extent of the curse met. As the entire population gathered in the great square, not to dance, but to stand in concentric circles facing the palace, their faces smooth and unlined, their expressions wiped clean of all humanity, waiting for a command that would never come. The sheer weight of the absolute silence began to wear down the last vestiges of Duke Valerius' sanity, for to live among the perfectly preserved dead is to become a ghost in one's own life, and the once beauty of Alara became the sharpest torment. He sought solace in the archives, finding scrolls written in forgotten tongues that spoke of the nature of Moros the architect, not as a man, but as a fundamental force, a cosmic principle that seeks the cessation of all motion and the reduction of existence, to pure form a sculptor whose medium is not clay, but life itself. The scrolls detailed that the engine of stasis fed not on energy, but on memory and potential, for every moment that was halted by the mechanism was a moment that could never become a memory, and every future that was erased was a potential devoured. This revelation struck Valerius with the force of a physical blow. He had not merely signed away the noise of his kingdom, he had bartered away their very souls, their right to a future, their right to be remembered by time itself, for a perfect stillness is history's true undoing. His final descent into a desperate madness was catalyzed by his confrontation with the Duchess Alara, whom he dragged from the silent crowd back into the palace, and he pleaded with her to scream, to cry out, to even curse him too, show any flicker of the passionate woman he had loved, but she merely gazed at him with that fixed, luminous expression, her preservation a mockery of life. In a moment of exquisite agony, Valerius took a silver letter opener from his desk, a relic from his childhood, and he pressed it against her perfect, preserved skin, expecting blood, but finding only the cool resistance of marble, for Alara was no longer flesh and blood, but something ancient and immovable, a perfect statue cast in the image of his desire. He collapsed before her monument, sobbing, not for her death, which had been gentle, but for her non-life, the eternal emptiness that he himself had decreed. And it was in that moment of profound isolation that he understood the only way to break the silent treaty was to introduce a noise so discordant, so catastrophic, that it would overload the engine of stasis. But what sound could challenge the perfect cosmic silence of Moros's design? It could not be a simple human voice, nor the ringing of a bell. It had to be an act of complete and utter self-immolation, a final gesture of defiance. That proved that the human spirit cannot be contained in a prison of stillness. The Duke knew that the heart of the engine lay deep beneath the throne room, the very sanctum of his power, and he knew that Moras had left a failsafe a weakness. That only a sovereign could exploit, because true cosmic horrors always savor the irony of their own undoing. He retrieved the ancient crown of Oakhaven, a heavy diadem forged from pure white gold that was said to contain the distilled essence of his lineage, and he walked back into the silent square, where his subjects stood like cold statues awaiting their eternal dawn. The Duke stood before the silent legion of his people, the crown of Oakhaven heavy on his head, a cold weight that was the last symbol of his shattered authority, and he knew that the loudest noise he could make was the sound of a sacrifice witnessed by eternity. With the crown upon his brow, he descended into the subterranean vault beneath the throne room, following the low-thrumming resonance that was the engine of stasis, an enormous, intricate mechanism of polished brass and frozen clockwork, where steam hissed silently through pipes and gears turned without a sound, a monument to Moras's genius for perfect stillness. In the center of the chamber was the core, a pulsing crystal that seemed to inhale the light and exhale the silence. And Valeris realized that the core was not powered by fuel, but by the concentrated absence of human noise and desire for every suppressed emotion. Every unsaid word fed its dreadful power. He raised the silver letter opener, the same cold instrument that had failed to wound his wife, and plunged it not into the core, which was protected by an invisible, shimmering force field, but into his own chest, directly over his heart, for the final act of human defiance is the loudest sound in the universe. As his royal blood, warm and mortal, spilled onto the brass gears, it created the ultimate discord, a stain of chaotic imperfection. On Moras's perfect design, and the pain that tore through Valeria's was the scream that Oakhaven had been forbidden to utter. The engine of stasis shrieked, a high-pitched sound that was not heard by the ear but felt in the soul, a sound of immense cosmic failure. And the chamber began to shake violently as the brass mechanism seized and tore itself apart. Up above in the city, the perfect stasis broke, not in a wave of sound, but in a sudden shocking rush of time that caught the silent citizens mid-motion for the years they had spent, frozen now accelerated, through their bodies. In an instant, the polished marble walls crumbled to dust, the velvet robes of the courtiers turned to rags in a moment, and the Duchess Alara, standing in the palace garden, finally moved her eyes, blinking slowly. But in that brief movement, the decades of unlife claimed her, and she collapsed, her preserved body dissolving into a pile of fine white powder, leaving only the wedding ring that rolled silently across the flagstones. The silent treaty was broken, but the cost was absolute, for Oakhaven was not restored to life. It was accelerated to its ruin, becoming a ghost city of accelerated decay. A ruin born not of war or fire, but of the desperate wish for static perfection. Valeris, the Duke, who loved too much, died an instant later, his final sight the collapse of his perfect, gilded prison, his sacrifice ensuring that his people, though annihilated in a moment of terrible time distortion, were at least free from the endless, empty terror of the stillness. And so the city of Oakhaven vanished from all maps, a cautionary tale whispered among cartographers that some secrets of the universe are best left buried, for there is no greater tragedy than the attempt to stop the inevitable flow of time, and no greater beauty than the ephemeral chaos of true human life. This hidden chapter reminds us that true existence lies not in preservation, but in the passionate embrace of every fleeting moment. Every loud argument and every tear that falls for silence can be the most profound and terrible killer of all. We hope this deep dive into the pseudo-history of the Marble Kingdom gave you pause for thought, for here at the Unveiled Scroll we believe that the shadows often teach us more than the light. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through the annals of forgotten suffering. If this tale of tragic beauty resonated with you, please consider checking out our video on the 7 Sleepers of Valeria, or perhaps the myth of the cartographer as shadow to equally dark chapters that we VA pulled from the forgotten libraries of time. Until we meet again in the twilight, keep your eyes open and your voices loud, travelers.